So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Backroads Arizona Mechanical. In this video, I'm going to go over diagnosing and rebuilding an electric fuel pump, showing you what happened with my electric fuel pump on my fuel station on my toy hauler. And keep in mind that these fuel pumps are all generally the same, whether they're in a pickup bed and on an auxiliary fuel tank or in a fuel station for a toy hauler. So even if your pump is not identical to this one, this video might still help you out. So let's get to it. So on my fuel pump, I had two separate issues. When I first got this toy hauler, I tried turning the pump on, it was locked up. So I had to get the pump where it was not locked up so I could check it further, and I ended up with a fuel leak and had to reseal it as well. So the first thing I did was find the two wires going to the switch for the pump. So I found the one coming from the battery and tested that. Now I'm actually using my power probe for this, but a $10 Harbor Freight special voltmeter will work as well. Just put your black wire of your voltmeter on a ground of the frame and put it on DC volts to test power. Make sure you shave down to bare metal for your ground on your voltmeter, otherwise you will not get a proper voltage reading. So we've got 13 volts, so that's good. Now we're going to go ahead and turn the switch on and check the power coming out to the fuel pump itself. So I prefer to have my inline fuse on the supply going to the switch. However, they had it after the switch going to the pump. I tested it there. We had 10.4 volts. So we do have voltage coming out of the switch. So when there's not a timer, you actually have a switch inside the fuel pump. So I pulled the cover off and tested power going through the switch inside the pump. And we had 10.2 volts on each side of that switch as well. The other thing you want to do, which I forgot to get a video of, is testing your ground. So once you've verified that you do have 12 volts, the easiest way to test your ground is to go ahead and use the black wire going into the pump as your ground and check power again. If you're still reading 12 volts, then you know your ground is good. Now, if you lose the voltage when you turn the switch on and you know you had power through the switch, it could be something as simple as a weak connection where it's pulling power or ground from. Or it could be something as bad as the motor or pump is locked up and that is drawing the voltage down that much. So once I verified I had a good power and ground, that was kind of bad news because that means I've got something else going on or my pump is locked up. So I decided to go ahead and pull the pump all the way down off the trailer. There was 2 bolts holding it, disconnected the 2 wires going to it and the 2 fuel lines. There was a lot of cuss words involved, but I did get it down. So after getting it off on the ground, I took the 4-bolt cover off of the fuel pump side, pulled out my driven gear, which is the one that is not on the motor shaft, and spun the drive gear, which is the one on the motor shaft. And I was actually surprised that it spun because I figured it was going to be locked up. Usually there is a fuel strainer. I pulled that out real quick, make sure you don't have a bunch of debris. Now, if that is clogged, you could have a bunch of crap in your tank that you need to flush out. So since I really didn't see anything obvious on that side, I went ahead and pulled both covers off on the other side to check out more of the electrical. So right here is your switch for your fuel pump. It did have a little bit of a loose connection. Now I did test voltage on both sides of the switch and it was going through. However, being though this is on a toy hauler with a timer switch externally, I don't need this switch because it's just in the on position all the time. So I'm going to bypass it. So I ended up putting a male spade on one side of this wire. I'm going to put these wires together and electrical tape them together. So the other benefit of bypassing that is just simplifying the system. It's one less thing that can go wrong later. So I just took a couple wires and made a jumper so I could run this pump off the battery off my truck to see what's going on. And it's spinning fine without the other gear and the cover on. So there is no timing on this gear, on the idler. There is a timer on this one. You got that little keyway. Now I have had these shear this keyway too, but this one looks good. So make sure everything's spinning. So we'll put the cover back on and jump it one more time and make sure it's still spinning. So the stupid O-ring kept popping out on me, so I just took a couple dabs of silicone and just used that to help hold it in position until I get the bolt started. Make sure if you have to use silicone to hold it, you wipe off all the silicone on the inside of the O-ring so none of it gets lodged inside the pump. So when going back together, make sure your screen's in correctly and just get all the bolts started. I always start them by hand Now I am using my impact, but I know my impact pretty well, plus there is a shut off when it starts torquing on an automatic setting on this impact, because an impact this size would easily strip out the threads in the housing. Tried it again, and once again we were locked up. So I decided to loosen all 4 bolts on the cover just a little bit and then jump it again and see if it spins. And it does, so therefore the gears must be swollen from being so old and just pushing against the cover too hard, which is locking it up. So I'm going to take it back apart and sand down the gears a little bit. So I took both gears out. Now these gears are just plastic, so sandpaper is going to do just fine. I went ahead and jumped it again, and the motor's turning without a problem, just to double check myself. And while I had the motor running, I went ahead and felt the wires to make sure they weren't getting hot like it was binding up. So to sand these down, I laid this flat on the ground, sanded it down with a little bit more aggressive sandpaper. Then I did it with some smoother sandpaper. And then I went ahead and kind of did the outside like this. And I just took a little bit of material off of one side of the gear and the top edges. I'm going to put them back in and see if we spin now. I didn't figure you guys needed to see me put it back together again, but it is turning freely now. So after I was happy with the way it was running, I went ahead and put both covers back on for the electrical. Remember, I bypassed the switch, and we're going to bolt it back up. Right here, I'm just crimping the wires back in. It only had a 3/8 suction line, so I decided to remove that and put a 1/2 inch with a 1/2 inch inline filter. All right, so this is my first time trying this. I'm going to turn the timer on. Oh, that sounds promising. Oh, wow, that's pumping pretty dang good. Look at that. Cool.
Guess I'm gonna hit your head.
Just happened.
I think Ozzy hit his head.
So my daughter thought it was the dog hitting his head underneath the toy hauler, but it was the tank from the vacuum because I forgot to loosen the fuel tank lid to let it breathe. I'm actually thinking about running some type of a ball valve so I can breathe the tank from the same side as what the pump is on to make it easier. So that could be coming on a later video. So after running the fuel pump for less than 30 seconds, filling up that gas can, I developed a fuel leak. It's coming from the back side of the housing here. So that sucks. I did not take the pump all the way down for this repair. I just took the housing bolts off. So to remove the fuel housing, I had to remove 3 bolts. These 2 and then 1 more that's not visible on the top. Alright guys, so I showed you where that leak was. And what it was is, if you notice right here, you notice this little cutout area right here, that's a weep hole. And that's where all my fuel is coming from. So the purpose of that weep hole is so the fuel, if that seal does go bad, does not build pressure and force itself down into the electrical motor. So we're going to pop that seal out so we can replace it. Alright, so I've got this hook. We're going to try and get behind this seal and see if we can leverage it out. And it's coming. Cool. I thought it was going to be more difficult than that. So I ended up getting an overhaul kit that had the seals and the O-rings. This one fit my pump. However, there are different pumps that take different kits. Okay, so this seal looks to be identical, so we're going to slap it in there. So on all seals, you have a direction on your seal. You'll notice this little spring that goes around the rubber part right here. That is going to be the side that is retaining your fluid. It doesn't matter what fluid it is. The side that has the spring holding the rubber is the side that your fluid goes on. And then what I've got is a socket that is barely smaller than what the seal outer diameter is. And then we're going to use a little bit of a mallet to tap this into place. So for the most part, the seals usually bottom out. However, pay attention to yours as you remove it so you know how deep it was set in. And that's all there is to it. So in order to put the housing back on the motor, I needed to pull the cover off again. This might leak fuel. There we go. Truth be told, it would have been easier probably to pull the whole pump down again to do this. However, I got so frustrated the first time with the 2 bolts that hold it to the trailer, I didn't want to do that again. And then I ended up pulling off the supply hose anyways so I could get the right angle to put the housing back on the motor. So I had to scrape all the old silicone off from the previous time I had put it together to see if it actually worked before I saw the fuel leak. Surprisingly enough, the new O-ring didn't want to stay in the groove either, so I ended up using a couple dabs of silicone again to hold it in place while I put it together. And once again, I used a rag to take off any extra silicone that was on the inside of that O-ring so it did not get lodged in the pump. Then made sure the screen was clean again and got it ready to assemble as well. And pulled the gears out, so we're just stabbing the housing to start. So be careful with the housing as you put it over the shaft to make sure you do not damage the seal. Then I started all 3 of my bolts by hand and used a wrench to tighten them down. Be careful tightening these down. These are 1/4-inch bolts going into an aluminum housing, so you don't want to over tighten them and strip them out. So then I went ahead and reinstalled my fuel supply line and tightened all the hose clamps back up. That's a good view of the 1/2-inch line I put on instead of the small 3/8 that was on it when I got it, and I do think this helped with my volume coming out of the nozzle. Now these gears are the same between the 2, so you don't have to worry about which one goes where. They're identical. I would recommend once you get them in there, make sure they spin nicely. Then you got your fuel strainer and your keyway, which you just have to line up the shaft with the gear. Make sure your O-ring is still staying in there like it should be. Make sure your strainer lines up correctly when you put the back cover on. Go ahead and start the bolts by hand again, and this time, because I could not use my impact because of the distance between the frame rail, I used a 1/4-inch ratchet to tighten all 4 of the bolts down. Then using a couple zip ties, I tied up the fuel supply line to make sure it would not kink or fall down. So we're going to turn it on. And we are pumping pretty well, actually. That's actually putting out pretty good volume out of a 1/2-inch suction line, with no more fuel leak coming out of the pump. So one other issue I was having with the fuel station was the fuel station door was becoming very hard to open and close. I'd usually end up getting a screwdriver to help pop it open and closed. So what I ended up doing to rectify this problem is mounting the hinge a little bit lower on the bracketry so that it would not rub against the toy hauler. So I ended up putting 1 screw in, checking to make sure it closed nicely, and then went ahead and anchored the rest of the screws back in the hinge. However, I ended up developing another problem. The lock and the hand latch would no longer close all the way, so I ended up having to take the levers off of the latches, grinding them down on my bench grinder a little bit until they were short enough where they would lock all the way. Once I got them both working good, I put silicone on the threads of the bolts holding the levers in position so they would not back off. So please be respectful of the land when you go camping and riding, and try and leave it cleaner than when you first came. And hopefully this video gave you some good information and it helped you out. If so, hit like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.